My brother stood at the podium at our mother's funeral and cried in a way that filled the room. He spoke about her for 11 minutes. He said she was the center of everything. He said she was the most selfless woman he had ever known. He said losing her was the hardest thing he had ever survived. Every person in that church listened to him and believed every word. I sat in the front pew and listened too. I knew something that none of those people knew. I knew that 9 days before she died, my brother had driven to the hospice facility alone, without telling me, with a lawyer he had hired himself, and had sat at our mother's bedside while she signed a document that gave him almost everything she owned. I did not know this yet on the day of the funeral. I would not know it for another 4 weeks, but I want you to understand the specific feeling of sitting in a pew listening to a man cry over a woman he had just finished stealing from. Even if you do not yet know the shape of what he did, something in you sometimes recognizes a performance when you see one. Before I go on, if this story connects with something real in your life, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely feel it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. My name is Maya, I am 26 years old, and I grew up in Kettering the way most kids grow up in mid-size Ohio towns, with a specific awareness of the particular texture of the place that you do not notice is specific until you leave and come back and understand by contrast what it always was. The street we lived on was wide and quiet and lined with maples that turned a specific orange in October that I have not seen exactly replicated anywhere else. The neighbors knew each other the way neighbors know each other in places where people stay for a long time rather than passing through, with the particular familiarity that accumulates over years of borrowed cups of sugar and driveways shoveled out on winter mornings without being asked. My mother had lived on that street for 23 years by the time she got sick. She knew every house and every family in every house, and she was the person people called when something happened because she was a nurse, and because she was the kind of person who answered when called. Our house was a 3-bedroom Dutch colonial with yellow shutters that my mother repainted herself every 4 years, and a kitchen that got the afternoon light, and a backyard with a garden she maintained with the same disciplined attention she brought to everything she cared about. She grew tomatoes and basil and 2 varieties of pepper, and a row of sunflowers along the back fence that were entirely decorative and entirely her. She was a practical woman in almost every respect, and the sunflowers were the one place where she was not practical. And I loved this about her from the time I understood what it meant. This is the story of how a hospice nurse named Carol and a lined notebook she kept by her station changed everything. My brother thought he had already finished. Now let me take you back to the beginning, not the funeral, before that. To the house on Birchwood Lane in Kettering, Ohio, where my mother Ruth raised 2 children on a registered nurse's salary and a patience I have never seen matched in another person. My mother was 52 years old when she died. She had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer 3 years before that, when I was 23 and my brother Derek was 33. Derek is 10 years older than me. He was already married with 2 children and a house in a suburb 20 minutes from ours when the diagnosis came. I was living in an apartment in Columbus, 2 hours away, working at an accounting firm where I had been for 14 months and was just starting to feel like I understood what I was doing there. When my mother was diagnosed, I drove home the weekend after she called me. I sat on the couch that had been in our living room since I was in middle school, and my mother explained the puns. My mother worked the day shift at Miami Valley Hospital for 26 years. She left at 6:45 every morning in her scrubs and came home at 4:30 unless there was something she could not leave, and then she came home later and was tired in the precise way that people are tired when they have spent 8 or 10 hours being responsible for things that matter enormously. She did not complain about this. She mentioned it the way you mention the weather, as a fact of the landscape rather than a grievance with it. On evenings when she came home late, I would have dinner started because I had learned to cook at 11 with the specific motivation of a child who understood that the person who usually did this thing was too tired to do it, and that the thing still needed doing. She thanked me every time. She always sat down at the table even when she was tired and asked me how my day was and listened to the answer. I think this is where I learned that showing up is not the same as being present and that the second one is harder and more valuable. She was present even when she was tired. That is not a small thing. I understood this even then without having the words for it. I have the words for it now: staging and the treatment plan and the odds in the precise way of a woman who had spent 30 years as a nurse and understood what the words meant and was not going to soften them on her own behalf. She said she intended to fight it. She said she had good doctors. She said she needed both of her children to keep living their lives and not to rearrange everything around her illness because she would not have that. I said okay. Derek, who was on speakerphone because he was driving somewhere he could not leave, said, of course, "Mom, whatever you need." He said it the way he said most things, with the fluency of someone who has learned that the right words said quickly can substitute for the more inconvenient things words sometimes require. Derek had always been the center of I want to describe my mother in the way that she actually was, rather than the way people describe the dead, which tends toward the general and the soft-edged. She was not a soft-edged person. She was specific and sometimes impatient, and had very clear opinions about a number of things that she did not always express diplomatically. She thought most desserts were too sweet. She had strong feelings about people who did not indicate when changing lanes. She believed that the most honest thing you could do for someone who was sick was to tell them precisely what you knew and precisely what you did not know, and to refuse to dress either category up as something it was not. She applied this to her own illness with a consistency that I found both admirable and occasionally difficult to be around. She did not ask for comfort in the form of reassurance. She asked for comfort in the form of presence. Being there was what she wanted. Showing up was what she valued. She had a phrase she used when she was pleased with someone that I have been turning over in my mind for the past several months. She would say, "You showed up for that one. Not well done or good job, or I am proud of you. You showed up for that one." As if the act of being present and continuing to be present was the primary measure she used for things done right. I think she measured Carol that way. I think she would have been satisfied to know that Carol had shown up in the specific form of a lined notebook and a filed report and a phone call on a Tuesday evening. You showed up for that one. That is what she would have said. The family in a specific way that I only fully understood as an adult. He was charming and loud and good at making our mother laugh, and he had been, for as long as I could remember, the version of her children that she bragged about to other people. He was 10 years older than me, and by the time I was conscious of family dynamics, he was already a successful financial advisor with a beautiful wife named Sandra and 2 children who were always presented in Christmas photos with matching outfits. My mother was proud of him in the visible, enthusiastic way that people are proud of things that reflect well on them, and she loved him genuinely, and I never doubted that. I also never fully understood, until much later, the particular way in which Derek understood that love as something he was owed rather than something he had been given. I was the younger child, and I am not going to pretend that our relationship with our mother was identical because it was not. She loved me. I knew she loved me. But Derek had been there first and had established himself as the primary relationship, and I had grown up in the particular position of the second child in a family organized around the first one. I was not unhappy. I want to be honest about that. I had a good childhood in a warm house with a mother who showed up to every school event and made my Derek had 2 children, a boy named Caleb who was 8, and a girl named Lily who was 5 when my mother was diagnosed. They were good children in the way that children are good when they have not yet been required to be anything else, which is to say they were loud and energetic and wanted a great deal of attention, and Sandra managed this with the competence of a woman who had organized her entire identity around being a mother in the same way Derek had organized his around being a success. The 4 of them had a life that looked, from the outside, like the kind of life that is going very well, which is the most useful kind of life to have if what you are primarily concerned with is appearances. Sandra was pleasant to me. She was pleasant in the specific way of someone who has decided that you occupy a particular position in the hierarchy and is treating you consistently with that position. I was never sure whether she was aware she was doing this. I was sure it was happening. I noted it the way I noted most things that I could not address directly and return to when I had more context for what it meant. Derek and Sandra had a house in Centerville with 4 bedrooms and a finished basement and a kitchen that had been renovated the year before my mother's diagnosis with the kind of countertops that cost more per square foot than I was paying per month in rent at the time. They took a vacation every August. Their Christmas cards arrived in matching frames. On the surface, everything about their life said we have arranged things correctly. What I understood later was that the arrangement had a specific dependency on an inheritance that had not arrived yet, and that this dependency had been growing quietly for years in the way that dependencies do when the person who has them believes they are entitled to what they are waiting for. Birthday cakes from scratch and stayed up with me when I was sick. But I understood from early on that Derek occupied a different altitude in the family, and I had made my peace with that in the way that younger siblings often do, by becoming self-sufficient in the specific ways that do not require that altitude. When my mother's cancer progressed into her second year of treatment, I began driving home more often, weekends when I could manage it, taking my laptop so I could work from her kitchen table on Friday evenings, driving her to appointments when Derek was unavailable, which was more often than it should have been, but which I did not comment on directly because my mother would not have welcomed it. She had a very specific thing she did when someone criticized Derek in her presence, not anger exactly, a kind of closing, the way a window closes when the weather changes. I had learned not to cause that closing. In the third year, the treatment stopped working. The oncologist used words that meant a specific thing, and my mother understood them and came home and sat in her chair in the living room and was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Well." That was all. Just well. And then she asked me to make tea. I made tea, and we sat with it, and the house was quiet in the particular way houses are quiet when something has shifted permanently inside them. Derek came that weekend. He cried in the kitchen with our mother and held her hands and said all the right things. He was good in crisis situations if the crisis did not require sustained effort over time. The sustained effort was harder for him. I noticed this and noted it, and the 3 years of my mother's illness had a texture I want to describe, because I do not think the texture is separable from the story. It was not 3 years of continuous crisis. It was 3 years of ordinary life with a different weight to it. Monday mornings that looked like any other Monday morning except that you were aware at every moment of a thing that was happening underneath the ordinary surface of them. My mother continued to work for the first 18 months. She reduced her hours in the second year. She stopped working in the third. She was not a person who handled not working easily. She was a person whose sense of herself was connected to being useful in specific practical ways. And when she could not work, she redirected that capacity towards other things. She organized her house with a thoroughness that I had not seen before. She went through every closet and every drawer and every box that had been in the basement since before I was born, and she sorted things with the specific focus of a woman who has decided that the people who come after her should not have to deal with a mess. She labeled things. She donated 4 boxes to the church thrift store. She threw away things she had kept for decades for reasons she no longer remembered. She cooked large batches of things and put them in the freezer with dates on them. I understood what she was doing, and I did not say so. And she did not say so, and we moved around the knowledge of it together without ever placing it directly between us. This was a specific kind of consideration, and I felt it as consideration even when it was also grief, said nothing. The hospice facility was called Lakeview, and it was 20 minutes from our mother's house. She moved in on a Tuesday in April 7 weeks before she died. I took the week off work to help with the move. Derek brought Sandra and the children for the first Sunday visit, and they stayed 2 hours, and the children were well behaved, and Sandra brought flowers, and Derek held our mother's hand and talked about everything except the thing that was happening, and my mother seemed to prefer that, and I tried to prefer it too. I visited every other day for the 7 weeks she was there. I drove the 2 hours from Columbus on weekday evenings after work when I could. I learned the staff by name. I knew the nurse's rotation schedule. I knew that my mother's preferred aide on morning shifts was a woman named Gloria who brought her crossword puzzle books and did not talk too much. I knew that she slept better with the blinds partially open and worse when the room was too warm, and that she had very specific feelings about the kind of crackers they offered with soup. Carol worked evening shifts 4 days a week. She was in her early 50s, a registered nurse with 23 years at Lakeview, in a manner that I liked immediately, the specific manner of a person who has been present for the end of enough lives to have developed a particular kind of honesty about what is happening without losing the ability to be kind at the same time. She was not warm in the performed way. She was warm in the practical way, which I found more useful and more believable. She and my mother had a rapport that developed over the first 2 weeks, and I used to arrive on Carol's shift evenings sometimes and find them mid-conversation about something I had not expected. My mother's opinions about a particular detective novel series, or Carol's daughter who was applying to nursing school. My mother liked Carol. I noted that. Derek visited less frequently than I voiced. The hospice staff became, in the 7 weeks of my mother's stay, a specific kind of presence in my life that I had not anticipated and that I want to acknowledge here. They were not grief counselors, they were not friends. They were professionals doing a very specific job in very specific circumstances, and they did it with a consistency of care that I found, in those weeks, more stabilizing than almost anything else. There is a particular quality to the attention of someone who has made their work the work of being present for endings. It is not detached. It is not clinical in the way that word sometimes means cold. It is something else, a kind of clear-eyed tenderness that does not look away and does not pretend and does not require you to perform a particular version of your grief for them. Gloria, who brought the crossword books. The aide named Tom, who always knocked twice before entering and who had the specific, unhurried manner of someone who understands that the thing they are attending to cannot be rushed. The social worker who met with me once in a small room off the main hallway and asked how I was doing with the deliberate specificity of someone who wanted an actual answer. And Carol, who wrote things down, who filed a report she was not required to file, who kept a lined notebook at her station and filled it with observations that she understood might matter to someone later, even if she did not yet know to whom. I did not know any of this while my mother was alive. I only knew Carol as the nurse on evening shifts with the practical warmth in the crossword conversations and the way she said goodnight to my mother at the end of each shift in a specific tone that suggested she meant it as more than a formality. I am grateful for all of it. I am especially grateful for the notebook. I tracked this without meaning to because I drove past his office on my way to the highway some evenings and could see whether his car was in the lot. On the evenings his car was in the lot, I understood he had not made the 40-minute drive to Lakeview that day. I do not say this to cast him as a villain in this part of the story. People grieve differently and manage proximity to dying differently, and I understood that. What I can say is that I was at Lakeview more than he was, and that what happened there happened on a day when I was not there. My mother died on a Saturday morning in June. I had been there the evening before. I had stayed until 9. She had been less lucid in the final week, drifting in and out of clarity in the way that the nurses had told me to expect, present, and then not present, and then present again in a different register. The evening before she died, she was alert enough to hold my hand and tell me that she was proud of me. She said it the specific way she had always said things she wanted me to carry. Slowly, looking at me directly, making sure I understood that this was not a passing comment. She said, "Mara, I am so proud of who you are." She used my childhood nickname, which she had not used in years. I said, "I know, Mom." I held her hand until she fell asleep, and then I drove home in the dark. She died at 6:40 in the morning. The hospice called me at 6:53. I called Derek from the parking lot of a rest stop on the highway where I had pulled over when my phone rang. He answered on the third ring. I told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." And then he said, "I'll meet you there." The funeral was on a Thursday. 111 people came. Nurses she had worked with for decades, neighbors from Birchwood Lane, her book club, 3 women she had gone to nursing school with 40 years before who drove from different states, people who had known her as a nurse and people who had known her as a neighbor and people who had simply known her as the kind of person who is impossible not to know because her presence in a room is its own kind of weather. Derek gave the eulogy. He cried genuinely, I believe, and he said things about her that were true, and he was good at it in the way he was good at things that had an audience. 4 weeks after the funeral, a letter arrived from a law office I did not recognize. It was addressed to me, and it was formal, and it informed me that I was named in my mother's will, and that a reading would take place at their offices on a date 2 weeks from the letter. It had the name of the law office at the top, and a signature I did not know. I called Derek. He said, "Oh yes, that," and his voice had a specific quality I did not recognize immediately, and then I did. Flat. The voice of a person who knows what is coming and has already arranged themselves around it. He said, "I'll be there." The reading was on a Wednesday. I want to tell you what it was like to drive home from that will reading. I want to tell you because I think it is the most honest part of this story, and because I have thought about it many times since. I walked out of Edwin Marsh's office and I walked to my car in the parking garage and I sat in the car for 22 minutes before I started the engine. I know it was 22 minutes because I looked at the clock when I got in and looked at it again before I turned the key, and the numbers had changed by 22. I was not crying. I was not doing anything in particular. I was sitting with the specific weight of having had a number of things confirmed simultaneously. That my mother had signed a document that did not reflect her wishes. That my brother knew this. That the document had been prepared and executed with deliberate speed while she was still alive and close enough to death that her signature could be obtained, but not close enough that people would have noticed yet or begun to ask questions. That the thing I had was a ceramic bowl and a library of books and the journals of a woman who would not be writing in them anymore. I thought about the diamond ring, my grandmother's ring, the specific knowledge that it was in Derek's house somewhere, in a box or a drawer belonging to no one who should have it. I started the car. I drove to the highway. I drove for 2 hours in the particular silence of someone who is moving through something that they have not yet found the language for and who understands that the language will come, but not yet. I ate a granola bar I found in my bag somewhere around the halfway point because I had not eaten since breakfast. I arrived home. I sat in the dark kitchen, and I thought about what my mother would have wanted me to do, not with the inheritance, with the knowledge. Afternoon at 2 o'clock. The office was in a building downtown that had the particular smell of carpet that had been there since the 1990s and window blinds that were slightly too large for the windows. A lawyer named Edwin Marsh sat behind a desk that had very little on it. He was in his 60s and had the practice-neutral expression of a man who has delivered news in both directions for many years and has learned not to accompany it with his own feelings. Derek sat across from him, and I sat next to Derek, and Edwin Marsh opened a folder. He read the will. It had been signed 11 days before my mother died. 11 days. She had died on a Saturday, and this document had been executed on a Tuesday. I did this calculation while Edwin Marsh was still reading, and I held the number very still in my mind while everything else moved around it. Under the terms of the document, my mother had left Derek the family home on Birchwood Lane and its full contents. She had left him her savings account, which contained $41,000 she had accumulated over 30 years of working. She had left him her investment account, which held another $18,000. She had left him her collection of jewelry, which included a diamond ring that had been her own mother's and which I had understood since childhood would one day be mine. She had left me her personal journals, her library of books, and a specific ceramic bowl that had sat on the kitchen windowsill my entire life that she had made in a pottery class in 1989. I looked at Derek while Edwin Marsh read the last paragraph, and Derek was looking at his hands. He did not look at me. Edwin Marsh finished reading. He folded the document carefully. He asked if there were any questions. I said nothing for a long time. Then I said, "When was this signed?" He said the date of execution was 11 days before her passing. I said, "Where was it signed?" He said, "At the Lakeview facility." I said, "Did you go to her yourself?" He said he had sent a colleague, a junior associate named Philip Crane, who had witnessed the signing along with a staff member at the facility. I said, "What staff member?" He checked his file. He said the record listed a witness signature from a facility staff member, but he did not have more detail than that. I said, "Was this the original will?" He paused in a very specific way. He said that it superseded a previous version. I said, "When was the previous version signed?" He said 3 years prior, at the time of her diagnosis. I drove home. I did not speak to Derek in the parking lot. He said my name once as I walked to my car, and I kept walking. I drove to Columbus in 3 hours and 20 minutes, and I sat in my apartment kitchen until it was dark outside, and I did not turn on the lights. I thought about my mother signing a document 11 days before she died. I thought about the specific degree of her lucidity in that final week. I thought about the previous visit before that Tuesday, which I had been present for, and how she had been confused about what day it was and had called me by her sister's name twice, and how the nurse on duty that evening had explained gently that this was typical for this stage and to speak to her in calm, short sentences. I thought about Derek knowing exactly what the previous will said. I thought about Derek being the only person who knew this new document existed. The 6 weeks between the will reading and Carol's phone call were the hardest weeks of this story for me, and I want to say that plainly. Not because I was not doing anything. I was doing things. I had spoken to 2 lawyers by phone who had explained the difficulty of contesting a will without specific medical evidence and who had not been encouraging. I had spent evenings doing research that went nowhere useful. I had the sense of a person who is standing in front of a door that is locked and has no key, and who knows the room they need is behind it and has no other way in. I went to work every day. I sat at my desk at the accounting firm, and I did the work, and my colleagues did not know what was happening in the part of my life that was not visible at my desk, and I did not tell them because there was nothing useful to tell that I could not yet prove. I called my mother's friend Betsy twice. Betsy was kind and did not know anything specific that helped. I drove to Kettering one weekend and walked through the house on Birchwood Lane, which was still in the estate and had not yet been transferred to Derek because the legal process had not completed. The yellow shutters. The kitchen with the afternoon light. The garden where the sunflowers were gone for the year, but the beds were still there, edged and ready, the way my mother always left them in the fall. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I looked at the windowsill where the ceramic bowl was, where she had already told the lawyer it was going to me. That bowl had been there my whole life. It had held keys and rubber bands and a specific blue pen she used for crossword puzzles and 3/4 of a roll of antacids, and now it held nothing, and I was looking at it in a house that a document said belonged entirely to my brother. I drove home. I went to work the next Monday, and 6 weeks after the reading my phone rang at 7:15 on a Tuesday evening. I did not have a plan. I had a feeling, and I had a date, and I had Edwin Marsh's neutral voice saying 11 days before her passing, and I had nothing else except the certain specific knowledge of someone who knew their mother and knew what 11 days before her death looked like from the inside. 6 weeks after the reading, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening at 7:15, a number I did not recognize. I almost did not answer. I answered. A woman's voice said, "Is this Maya?" I said yes. She said, "My name is Carol. I'm a nurse at Lakeview. I was your mother's nurse." She paused, and then she said, "I need to tell you something." I sat down on my kitchen floor. I said, "Please?" Carol told me the following. On the Tuesday that the will had been signed, she had been on shift. Derek had arrived at the facility at 1 in the afternoon with a man she did not know. She had not been informed in advance that anyone was coming, and this was unusual because family visits were typically logged. Derek had gone directly to their mother's room. Carol had been on routine rounds and had passed the room and seen an unfamiliar man with a briefcase and papers and had noted it. She had checked on their mother approximately 40 minutes before Derek arrived that day, and their mother had been in significant distress from breakthrough pain. She had administered medication at 12:20. The medication she had administered was a combination of a fast-acting pain reliever and a low-dose sedative that was part of their mother's comfort care protocol. This combination typically produced a window of reduced lucidity lasting between 90 minutes and 3 hours. Carol said, "Your mother was not lucid when she signed that document. She said it very precisely. She said I was not in the room. I did not witness the signing, but I had checked on her 35 minutes before, and she did not know what month it was. She asked me whether her own mother was coming to visit. Her own mother died in 1998. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wrote all of this in my nursing notes. The time I administered the medication, her condition at the time of my observation, my assessment of her mental state. It is all in the record. I filed an internal report with my supervisor that same day because I was concerned about what I had seen. The report is dated." She paused. She said, "I have been trying to decide whether to call you for 6 weeks. I said, I am glad you did." The following morning, I called a probate attorney named Diane Cho, whose name I found through a legal referral service after 2 hours of research the night before. I explained the legal standard to me during our second meeting, and I want to share what she explained because I think it is important and because I did not know it before, and I imagine many people do not. For a will to be valid, the person signing it must meet what is called testamentary capacity. This means they must understand the nature of what they are signing, the extent of their property, the identity of the people they are leaving that property to, and the nature of the legal act they are performing. This is a higher standard than simply being conscious or being physically able to hold a pen. A person can be awake and able to write their name and still not meet this standard if their cognition has been sufficiently compromised. The standard exists precisely because the moment of death and the period leading to it is the most common time at which vulnerable people are exploited by people who stand to benefit from documents signed in that window. Courts see this regularly. Judges who work in probate are familiar with the pattern. What makes such cases difficult is that the evidence required is medical and specific and must come from someone with standing to provide it. A grieving daughter saying my mother did not know what she was signing is not enough. A nurse saying at 12:55, I assessed this patient as disoriented and non-lucid. And here is the dated record of that assessment, and here is the medication log showing what she was given at 12:20 is a different kind of evidence. The law, Diane said, is not indifferent to these situations. It is only as effective as the evidence it has to work with. Carol gave us the evidence. Diane Cho was 44 years old and had been practicing probate law for 17 years. Her office was on the third floor of a building near the courthouse that had a waiting room with 2 plants she had clearly been taking care of for a long time, and a receptionist named Marcus who offered coffee with the particular efficiency of someone who has been offered the opportunity to be helpful and intends to use it. Diane herself had the bearing of a woman who has spent 17 years watching families behave badly under the pressure of inheritance and has developed a specific kind of matter-of-fact clarity about what she is seeing when she sees it. She did not express outrage when I told her what had happened. She did not tell me it was terrible or that it shouldn't have happened or offer any of the sympathetic framings that people sometimes use to make themselves feel like they are participating in a difficult situation without actually doing anything about it. She listened. She asked precise questions. She wrote things on a yellow legal pad with a specific handwriting that suggested a person who thinks faster than she writes and has developed an efficient shorthand for her own notes. When I finished, she looked at what she had written. She said the medication timing is the key. She said it the way a person says something they have identified as the load-bearing element of a structure. Everything else builds from that, she said. If the nurse's notes say what you think they say and they are dated and in the official medical record, then what your brother presented to that lawyer was not a consenting adult. It was a performance of consent with someone who had been chemically prevented from giving it. She paused. She said, "Do you want to proceed?" I said yes. She said, "Good. Then let's build the case correctly." Situation in the order it had happened, and I did not leave anything out. Diane listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Do you have the nurse's contact information?" I said yes. She said, "I need to speak with her. And I need you to request a full copy of your mother's medical records from Lakeview for the period of the final 3 weeks." I said, "Okay." He said, "I also need you to tell me about the previous will." I said, "I know it existed, and I know it was signed 3 years ago at the time of her diagnosis, and I know it was executed at a different law office." Diane said, "I need to find it." I said, "How?" She said, "I know how. Give me 2 weeks." Diane found the previous will in 10 days. It had been filed with the probate clerk at the time of signing and was part of the public court record. The previous will, signed 3. I want to tell you something about the original will, the one my mother had signed 3 years before, at the time of her diagnosis. When Diane's office located it in the probate records and sent me a copy, I sat with it for a long time before I could read it. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with a cup of tea that had gone cold and the document in front of me in the specific light of a lamp I had had since college, and I made myself read every paragraph in order. The language was precise and careful. She had named both of us clearly. She had listed the diamond ring specifically and written my name next to it in the bequest. She had noted that the sale of the house should be handled by a real estate agent of good standing and that the proceeds should be divided equally without delay. She had listed her jewelry collection as an equal division. She had specified the books as mine because she had written in the margin of the document in her own hand, "Maya has always been the reader." The lawyer had noted this margin addition and incorporated it into the formal language of the will. She had also written in the margin next to the savings account bequest one sentence in her precise nurse's handwriting that said, "Please use this to start something." I did not know what she meant by that. I am still not entirely sure, but I think she meant do not spend it on what is already done. Spend it on what is not yet built. I keep that sentence in a note on my phone now. I read it on difficult days. It functions for me as something close to instruction. Years before, left everything equally to both children with specific personal items designated for each. The diamond ring that had been her mother's was explicitly listed as a bequest to me by name. The family home was to be sold and the proceeds split evenly. The savings and investments were to be split evenly. It was an organized and deliberate document written by a woman who was fully lucid and had taken considerable care to be specific about her intentions. Carol agreed to speak with Diane. They had a conversation I was not present for that Diane summarized for me afterward. She said Carol's nursing notes were meticulous. She said the internal report Carol had filed the same day as the signing was dated and signed, and had been received by her supervisor and logged in the facility's administrative system. The supervisor confirmed the report existed and confirmed its contents when Diane contacted her. Diane said, he brought a lawyer to a hospice room with a woman who had been sedated 40 minutes before and had her sign a document. She said it without emotion. She said, "That is not a will. That is a document." Diane filed a petition with the probate court to contest the second will on the grounds of lack of testamentary capacity and undue influence. She submitted Carol's nursing notes and the internal report as exhibits. She submitted the medical records which confirmed the medication administration times. She submitted the records of Derek's visit log at the facility showing his arrival time as 1:14 in the afternoon. She submitted a statement from Philip Crane, the junior associate who had witnessed the signing, who, when contacted by Diane's office, confirmed that he had been present for approximately 20 minutes and that the patient had appeared to him to be in some discomfort, but had signed the document when directed to the signature line. Philip Crane had not known he was being asked to participate in what Diane described in her filing as a deliberate exploitation of a dying woman's incapacity. Derek hired a lawyer. His lawyer filed a response arguing that their mother, "I also want to tell you about Philip Crane, the junior associate who had witnessed the signing. He was 29 years old, 2 years out of law school, working at a small firm that took whatever work came through. He had been sent to Lakeview by a senior partner who had not told him very much about the circumstances. He had arrived, met Derek in the parking lot, been given a brief explanation, gone to the room, been present for approximately 20 minutes, watched an elderly woman sign a document that a man he had just met told him she wanted to sign, and co-signed as witness and left. He had not asked questions. He was not the kind of person at that stage of his career who had yet learned that the right question asked at the right moment can be the most important thing a person with legal training ever does. He had not noticed, or had not known to notice, the particular quality of the woman's attention in that room. The way she had drifted during the explanation of the document. The way she had looked at Derek rather than at the page when she was directed to sign. The way she had asked twice where she was. These are not the observations of someone who is looking for them. They become visible in retrospect, which is where Philip Crane made them when Diane Cho called his office and asked him specific questions in a specific order. He had not intended to participate in something wrong. He provided his statement. Diane said to me afterward that he had been visibly shaken on the phone, not because he was being accused of anything, but because he understood in that conversation what the situation he had been sent into actually was. I feel no particular anger toward Philip Crane. He was a junior associate who was sent somewhere and told to witness something and did not yet have the experience to recognize what he was being used for. What I feel is closer to recognition of how systems that depend on trust can be exploited by people who understand that most individuals in most situations are doing their jobs and not looking for something wrong. Had been capable of making decisions regarding her estate and had done so freely. The response did not address the medication timing. It did not address Carol's notes. It did not address the fact that the signing had occurred 35 minutes after Carol had found their mother unable to identify the month or remember that her own mother was deceased. Diane responded to the filing in 11 pages that I read 3 times because each time I read it, I felt something shift slightly in my chest in the direction of something I do not have a clean word for. Not relief, not satisfaction. The specific feeling of a thing being named correctly after a long period of it existing without a name. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in October, 4 months after the first phone call from Carol. I want to tell you about the hearing itself in a way I have not yet told it. Not the testimony, not the ruling, the moment before it started. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:40 on a Thursday morning in October. The building had the particular institutional smell of a place that has been cleaned the same way for decades, and the fluorescent lights in the hallway made everything look slightly more tired than it probably was. Diane met me outside the courtroom door at 8:50. She was carrying a leather briefcase that had seen a great deal of use and wearing a gray blazer, and she looked exactly like a person who is prepared and does not need you to tell her she is prepared. She said, "Good morning." She said, "How are you?" I said, "I am here." She said, "That is exactly right." She said, "We have what we need." She said, "Trust the record." Carol was standing in the hallway 30 feet away. She was in her regular clothes, not her scrubs, a dark blue cardigan and dark pants and low shoes. She looked like herself, which is to say she looked like a person who is doing what she believes is right and is not particularly concerned with whether it is comfortable. We made eye contact. She nodded once. I nodded back. That was enough. We went in. We sat down. The judge arrived. The fluorescent lights hummed the way fluorescent lights do, and I folded my hands in my lap and I thought about my mother's voice on the last evening I saw her saying, "Mara, I am so proud of who you are." And I thought, if you could see this room right now, I hope you would know we are here because of you. Because you left an original. Because you were a nurse who understood documentation. Because you knew what a drawer was for. I unfolded my hands. I sat up straight. The hearing began. Courtroom was not dramatic. It was a small county probate courtroom with fluorescent lighting and chairs that had been there since I was a child, and a judge named Patricia Whitmore, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the bearing of a woman who has heard a great deal and is not surprised by most of it, but has retained the capacity to be appropriately clear about the things that warrant clarity. Carol testified. She was on the stand for 40 minutes. She described the evening of the signing in the specific, careful language of a medical professional who has documented things for 2 decades and understands exactly what precision means in a sworn context. She described the medication she had administered at 12:20 and what it does and how long its effects last. She described her observation at 12:55 when their mother had not known the month and had asked about a person who had been dead for 25 years. She described what she saw through the window of the room at 1:31 when she passed on her rounds, a man with a briefcase and papers at the bedside of a woman who was listed in her medical records as having been assessed as disoriented and non-lucid 40 minutes prior. She described the internal report she had filed at 3:40 that afternoon. She was not emotional on the stand. She was precise and present, and she answered every question directly, and she did not waver. Derek's lawyer cross-examined her for 20 minutes. He asked whether she had been in the room during the signing. She said she had not. He asked whether she could state with certainty what their mother's mental state was at the precise moment of signing. She said she could not be in 2 places at once. She said what she could state with certainty was what her medical assessment had been 40 minutes before the signing, and that this assessment was documented and dated and part of the official medical record. She said she could also state that the medication she had administered does not wear off in 40 minutes. The lawyer moved on. Diane presented the medical records. She presented the internal report. She presented the previous will. She presented the statement from Philip Crane. She spoke for 35 minutes in a voice that did not rise and did not need to. When she was done, Judge Whitmore looked at the materials in front of her for a long time. Then she looked at Derek's lawyer. She said, "I have reviewed the exhibits," she said. "I have reviewed the testimony." She said, "I am prepared to rule." She said, "The court finds insufficient evidence of testamentary capacity at the time of the second will's execution. The court finds credible and uncontradicted evidence in the medical record and witness testimony that the decedent was not lucid at the time she was presented with documents for signature. The court voids the second will as executed under conditions that did not meet the legal standard for valid consent. The court reinstates the prior will as the operative document governing distribution of the estate." Derek sat at the table next to his lawyer and did not move for a long time. I was sitting in the gallery behind Diane's table, and I had my hands folded in my lap, and I looked at the back of my brother's head and thought about our mother in her chair on the day she was diagnosed, saying, "Well, just that one word," and asking me to make tea. I thought about Carol's voice on the phone saying, "I have been trying to decide whether to call you for 6 weeks." I thought about my mother saying, "Mara, I am so proud of who you are," in the dim room the evening before she died with her hand in mine. I thought about a lined notebook at a nursing station and a woman precise enough to write the time down. The redistribution took 4 months to finalize. The family home on Birchwood Lane was listed with a real estate. I went back to work the Monday after the hearing. My colleagues did not know what had happened in the previous several months, and I did not tell them on that Monday. I sat at my desk and I opened my spreadsheets and I did the work that was waiting for me, and I was present at my desk in the particular way you are present somewhere when you have just come through something and you are still slightly surprised to find yourself in ordinary circumstances. Ruth from accounts down the hall asked me how my weekend was, and I said fine, and she said you look tired, and I said I've had a lot going on, and she said the coffee is fresh, and nodded toward the break room, and that was the entirety of the comfort I received that Monday, and it was exactly enough. There is something to be said for the return to ordinary things after something extraordinary. It is not avoidance. It is the way a person learns that life continues to be larger than the worst thing in it, and that this is not a betrayal of the worst thing, but a fact about the size of living. I worked my full day. I ate lunch at my desk. I answered 12 emails. I closed my laptop at 5:18 and walked to my car in the parking lot and sat in it for a few minutes before starting the engine, the way I sometimes do when I need a moment between one thing and the next. The sky was the specific gray of Ohio in October at 5 in the evening. I drove home. I made dinner. Gerald, my upstairs neighbor's cat who had apparently decided several months before that he preferred my apartment and visited through the window I left cracked, was asleep on the couch in the position of an animal who has made himself entirely comfortable in a space he has decided belongs to him. I did not move him. I sat in the chair across from him, and I ate my dinner, and I thought about Carol and the notebook, and my mother's margin note in the will, and the ceramic bowl on the windowsill, and the diamond ring on my right hand, and I thought this is what it looks like when things go the way they should, and I tried to hold that clearly rather than immediately moving past it to the next thing. Agent and sold in February. The proceeds were split evenly. The savings and investment accounts were divided. Derek was required to return the jewelry that had been distributed to him under the invalid will, including the diamond ring that had been my grandmother's. I held that ring for a long time the first evening I had it. It was smaller than I remembered from childhood, older than I remembered. The gold was worn in two places in the way that something is worn when it has been on a hand for decades. My grandmother's hand, then my mother's hand, then a box in Derek's house for 7 months, now mine. I put it on my right hand and I kept making dinner. Derek and I have not spoken since the hearing. He sent one text message 3 weeks after the ruling which read, "I hope you're happy." I saved it in a folder the same way I save things that might matter later. Not because I expected to need it, but because I had learned by then that there is one more thing I need to tell you about Derek. Not about what he did to our mother, about what happened in the months after the hearing. 3 months after the ruling, with the estate redistribution still in process, Sandra filed for divorce. I found out through Betsy, who had heard from a neighbor on Birchwood Lane, who had heard it through the specific efficient information network that exists in neighborhoods where people have known each other for decades. I did not contact Derek. I did not contact Sandra. I do not know the specifics of what had happened between them. What I can say is that the version of their life that had appeared, from the outside, to be correctly arranged, had apparently been arranged around something that was not there anymore. I feel no satisfaction in reporting this. I want to be honest about that. What I feel is closer to a kind of recognition that when people build their lives around something they believe they are owed by someone else, the life has a specific fragility to it that is not always visible from the outside. When the thing they believe they were owed does not arrive in the form they expected, the structure of the life reveals what it was built on. This is not a judgment. It is an observation. Derek's children are 12 and 9 now. They did not choose any of this. I think about them sometimes in the abstract way you think about people you do not know well who are connected to you by blood and circumstance. I hope they are all right. I hope someone is showing up for them consistently. That is the whole of what I hope for them. The habit of keeping records is worth maintaining even when you do not know what you are keeping them for. I did not respond. There was nothing in that message that required a response, and everything in it that had already been answered by a probate judge in a fluorescent-lit courtroom on a Thursday in October. My mother had a friend named Betsy who had been at the funeral and who called me a month after the hearing when word had made its way through the people who knew our family. Betsy said, "Your mother would have wanted you to fight for it." I said, "I know." Betsy said she talked about you all the time. I said, "I know that too." Betsy was quiet for a moment, and then she said she kept a copy of her original will in the drawer of her bedside table for 3 years. She said she had shown it to Betsy once when she was visiting and told her where it was in case it was ever needed. I had not known this. I had not known my mother had done that. I sat with that information for a long time after I hung up the phone. My mother had kept a copy in her bedside drawer. She had shown it to her friend and told her where it was. A woman with 30 years of experience as a nurse who understood what illness does to families and had prepared for it the only way she had available to her. She had not been able to stop what Derek did, but she had placed something in a drawer and told someone where it was, and that is not nothing. That is a woman who knew what she was doing even when she could no longer stop what was being done to her. I want to say something before I go. I keep the original will in a folder on my desk now, not a digital copy, the physical document that Diane's office printed and certified. I look at it sometimes the way you look at something that represents a long chain of decisions made by different people at different times that somehow resulted in you being in the place you are in. My mother sat across from a lawyer in his office 3 years before she died, and she thought carefully about what she wanted to happen to the things she had spent 30 years building, and she wrote it down with specificity and signed it and left a copy in the drawer of her bedside table where her friend Betsy knew it was. A woman who understood documentation, a nurse. Someone who had spent 3 decades understanding that the record matters and that the record being accessible matters and that the people who might need it should know where it is. I think she knew, at some level, that she was creating protection. Not against a specific threat she could name, against the general fragility of a thing that only exists in your intentions if you do not also make it exist somewhere else. She put it in writing. She put the writing in a drawer. She told someone where the drawer was. These are not large gestures. They are small, deliberate ones. They are exactly the kind of gestures that determine whether the things that matter to you survive the period when you are no longer there to protect them yourself. There is something I want to say about the months after the ruling that I think matters to the full shape of this story. The redistribution of the estate was not emotionally simple just because it was legally correct. The house sold in February, and I was not there for the sale. I did not want to watch someone else buy the house on Birchwood Lane, and I did not want to stand in that kitchen again and feel the specific absence of what it used to contain. I received my half of the proceeds by wire transfer on a Wednesday afternoon in March, and I sat with my bank account open on my laptop for a long time looking at the number. It was more money than I had ever had at one time. It was also 41 years of my mother's working life split in half and transferred to a screen. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I held both of them. I called Camille, my closest friend from college who had been through most of this story with me by phone, and I said it came through. She said, "What are you going to do with it?" I said, "I am going to wait until I know." She said, "That is exactly what your mother would have said." She was right. I waited 4 months. Then I enrolled in an evening law program, not because I want to become a lawyer, because I want to understand the language of the things that happen to people so that when they happen, I am not dependent on someone else to translate them for me. My mother spent 30 years as a nurse, and she understood that knowledge of how things work is a form of protection. I am trying to learn that same thing in a different room with a different set of tools. Please use this to start something. I am starting. Not about Derek, not about what he did or what it cost him or what the law said about it, about Carol, about the specific courage it takes to call a number you are not sure you should call after 6 weeks of deciding on a Tuesday evening and say, "I need to tell you something," to a person you have only met in the context of their mother dying. She was not required to call me. She had filed her report. She had done what her professional obligations required. The call was something else. The call was a choice she made 6 weeks after the fact because she had been sitting with something she believed was wrong, and she had decided that sitting with it was not enough. I think about the version of this story where she does not make that call, where she files the report, closes the file, moves on to the next shift. That version exists. It is the more common version. I happen to be in the version where someone chose differently. I do not take that for granted. I also want to say this. The ceramic bowl my mother left me is on my kitchen windowsill now, the one she made in a pottery class in 1989. It is slightly uneven, which I think is because she made it herself and was not particularly skilled at pottery but finished it anyway because that was the kind of person she was. It holds my keys and a single smooth stone I found on a walk the week after she died, and a paperclip I keep meaning to put somewhere else. It is the first thing I see every morning when I walk into my kitchen, and every morning I see it, I think she made this with her hands in 1989, and she left it to me specifically, and she knew exactly what she was doing when she did. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story made you feel something, write it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to hear the story of a woman whose aunt had been secretly collecting rent on property she owned for 9 years and what the property records revealed, it is waiting for you in the description below. Click it. Until next time, Take care of yourselves. And if someone is trying to tell you that a document signed in a hospice room is the end of the story, remember that the person who was in that room the whole time might still have her notes. I also want to say something about what it means to keep a notebook. Not a digital record, a physical lined notebook at a nursing station that you carry from room to room on your shift. Carol had kept one for years. She told me this when I asked her about it later. She said she had been keeping one since her 3rd year of nursing because a senior colleague had told her once that the chart tells you the official story and the notebook tells you the real one, and that sometimes the two are the same and sometimes they are not, and the way you find out which is to write both down. She wrote in it every shift. Times. Observations. The small specific things that were true, but that do not always fit neatly into official medical language. The way a patient seemed. The questions they asked that did not correspond to the present moment. The quality of their attention. The names they called out that were not the names of people in the room. She said most of it never mattered beyond that one shift. She said once in a while it was the only thing that mattered to anyone. I asked her if she still kept the notebook. She said she had kept one every year for 23 years and she did not intend to stop.